It warms my heart in particular to welcome the Finchelstein family who arrived from Buenos Aires. Your son made us proud, and I'm sure that you are proud as well. Welcome. Good to see you here.
Thank you.
And of course the Finchelstein family. Laura is over there, and the two daughters, Gabi and Lucia. It's great to see you here. Okay, so we are here today not to bury Caesar, but to celebrate the publication of his book. In 2009, Federico published a book under the title Transatlantic Fascism, Ideology, Violence, and the Sacred in Argentina and Italy, 1919-1945. And I think the new book, this is the new book, The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War, Fascism, Populism, and Dictatorship in 20th Century Argentina, is an extension of the, or completion, if you will, of the first book, but in effect, yet another contribution that Federico makes to the analysis and documentation of what has been repressed and denied in Argentinian history, that is, the permutation of Argentinian fascism. This is a lifelong, Federico is still a very young person, but this is a lifelong commitment to a project that is both scholarly and political, that has immense, I think, importance to Argentinian history, but also has immense importance outside the boundaries of this country. The 2009 book, I think, made a huge and important argument for transnational history, for seeing Argentinian fascism not just as a homegrown phenomenon, but part of a global flow of ideas and political movements. I think this is also a hallmark of the new book. I read it over the last few days. I think it's a very strong aspect of this book. But I think if I'll just very shortly say something about what I think are the major contributions of this book. First is to show that Argentinian fascism is both an appropriation but also an indigenous phenomenon. It's not just an import. It was inherent and rooted in the Argentinian experience. Secondarily, to show us that the history of fascism did not end in 1945. Over the last 60 years, we often use fascism as an epithet, as a way to denounce and condemn totalitarian regimes. Federico shows us that fascism, real fascism, genuine fascism, never died. It was very much alive in the 70s and 80s, and perhaps even now. The third point is to demonstrate the uniqueness of Argentinian fascism, especially the alliance between the church and the army, between Catholicism and fascism. And the fourth contribution is the emphasis on the ideological origins and foundations of war atrocities. It's an aspect when we think about genocide, when we think about what happened during the Dirty War in the 70s and 80s, we sometimes forget this aspect of those historical events. So I think all of those are contributions that are very important for Argentinian history, but also have ramifications far beyond Argentinian history, Latin American history in general, but also in global transnational history. Congratulations, it's a great moment. Often there's this cliche that the birth of the book is like the birth of a child. That may be an exaggeration, but I think it's a great moment for you and for the community. Good luck.
I'm sorry.
Richard Bernstein is the very least professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research, and he'll be the first speaker tonight.
Okay. I think what makes Federico's book such an interesting book is not only some of the things that Oz has mentioned, it's a very personal book. I mean, it's a combination of of being passionately and personally concerned with the issues and using all his scholarly skills to really define and clarify it. And I think you get a sense of this in the first paragraph, which I like to read, because it shows this kind of personal, passionate theme in this. He says, the fascist idea defines the dirty war. And fascism provided the background for the principles and the practices and the violence that the Argentine government unleashed against a group of its citizens in the 1970s. And under the junta's rule, even a 5-year-old knew the name of the dictator. And while I cannot remember hearing political discussions in the middle-class Argentine Jewish home in which I was raised, I knew who the leader of the junta was. General Jorge Rafael Videla was a special figure with his grave voice, stern look, and mustache. My parents later told me that they had considered it too dangerous to discuss the junta in the presence of a child. They knew that too many people had disappeared. Like many Argentines, I am still trying to come to terms with the crimes against humanity committed under Videla's rule, the disappearances, the concentration camps, the citizens tortured, drugged, and then thrown into Atlantic from the military planes. So it's not just simply, it is a very fine third-person view, it's also a kind of personal encounter. How really to understand the dirty war, and particularly the sheer brutality of it, the concentration camps, the disappearance, and as an intellectual problem, it seems to me that the way in which Federico presents it is because if we go back in terms of the history of Argentina, the 19th century history, it may have looked as if the basis for a liberal constitutional country in which civil society plays an active role, the seeds were there. What he shows us, I mean, here's, I think, where another rather interesting thing about the book, fascism has become such a polemical term that, and still is a polemical term, which is used without any kind of integrity, is to restore it as a legitimate historical category. Now, the way in which he goes about this is really to show that, I mean, this is another, I think, beauty of the book, is fascism is immediately associated with Europe, and particularly with Mussolini. And when one speaks about fascism, one thinks, well, that's what's being appropriated. Now, there's a kind of very delicate and subtle kind of analysis here, in which Federico really wants to show it, yes, first of all, that there was a long tradition of fascism in Argentina, dating back to various nationalistic movements, going back to the 30s, and he traces this for us beautifully. It's a very complex history of the rise of different kinds of fascist tendencies in the history of Argentina, which was of a distinctive nature than anything that was going on certainly in Italy or in Nazi Germany, although there was there's another rather, I think, very interesting theme here that's particular to Argentina, but also has universal significance. Because as he traces the history, what he shows us is the emergence of various extreme right-wing groups, the kinds of groups that you would think are just marginal, are crazy, that nobody's going to take them seriously. And what I think that Federico shows is not only, I think, the universal principle to beware of that, because these right-stream groups began to influence a much more general ideology that shaped the various generals. I mean, he goes back to the early dictatorship, in the 1930s, and he really helps to restore, I think, the category of fascism as a legitimate historical category and not just a theme. And what I thought was particularly interesting for me is because what emerges is another thing which is wonderful about the book, is it's a distinctive blend, this distinctive form of fascism that he took, in which you see, and he doesn't want to pull any punches here, the very significant role that the church played, the complicity between the church and the army, the kind of, so you get a distinctive form of which is really quite different from anything in Europe. Ecclesiastical fascism, I think is the term he uses at one point, that is the emphasis on the sword and the cross. So that by the time you get to the Dirty War, there is a kind of sense that there is the enemy, whatever that is that you're fighting, and you're fighting it in the name of the Christian God, which is the God of Argentina. Another aspect of the book, I think, which is, of course, both, as I say, personal and intellectual, is something which is sometimes downplayed, but I think is rather significant, that although you have a significant Jewish community in Argentina, that there has been built into this from the very beginning, and not just appropriated, but in its own distinctive ecclesiastical Christian forms of anti-Semitism about this. Of course, it's not really just a history of the dirty war. That's not what he's doing here. It's showing that there was an ideological, so that the idea that it just suddenly emerged, that it was just the junta, is really a false way of looking at it. You have to see it in its particular context. And I see the book ending with a warning. I think that the warning is that not only against rewriting history and leaving out this chapter and seeing its power and its continuity from the 30s right up to the present, but also that these elements are still there in Argentine society. I mean, that the general idea that we're now democratic, we're liberal, we're open, for it is a bit too simple. That is true, but one should be wary of the elements. There's a lot that I haven't mentioned. I think another thing that is extremely fascinating in this book is the way in which popularism in Argentina turns from the left, from the right, becomes a people's meat, and how you get the unintended consequences of where it begins to fit in with a certain kind of fascist ideology. So I read the beginning of the book. I think it might be instructive to end my comments with just reading the end of the book, because this is what he says, this is the last paragraph, which shows that we should never be too facile, not realizing the extent to which certain motifs, certain themes can still exist in what might seem like a democratic, liberal society. There are still these undertones of certain kinds of pernicious aspects of fascism. This is what he has in the last paragraph, that this investigation set out to study the powerful influence of the nacionalista and the fascist prism on the 20th century Argentine history. The fact that many aspects of this ideology are still felt in the country, mostly by its past and present victims, shows that the nacionalista fiction about the country's reality was ultimately accepted by many. The long and tragic course of that ideology is both historic and ongoing. Nationalista ideology rewrites history, and repeating past ideas, it has aspired to deny the tragic sides of that history. And the intellectual origins of the dictatorship are those of a Christianized fascism, an Argentine-style fascism that has enduring powers.
professor of political and social theory at the New School for Social Research. Please.
Thanks a lot. So, Federico Finchelstein's important book does, in my view, at least two major things. It reconstructs, as Dick has shown, the ideological origins of the most repressive and most violent regime, very likely in Argentine history. But it also does a second thing, namely to study the relations of different ideological options to one another. I will focus on the second, specifically the relationship of fascism, populism, and democracy in his presentation. Instead of trying to extract definitions in the beginning, I will try to reconstruct the history the way Federico does. History must tell stories. The best and least violent story told by Federico takes place between Juan Perón and Joe Baxter in Madrid. Joe Baxter was a leader of the left part of the Tocuara movement. I think he can be characterized at least some of the time as a left Peronist, and he went to see the master on the wall, as Federico describes it, is a picture, painting, or photograph of Mussolini. And Juan Perón then proceeds to praise Joe Baxter about an article he has written in the past in which some interesting things have been said about Mussolini. Joe Baxter is strangely quiet during this discussion. When he leaves, the aide-de-camp to Juan Perón tells him, you know, these young kids, they would rather hear about Mao than Mussolini. That's still not the end of the story, because Joe Baxter was not going to be turned away from the leader that easily. And so he goes back, and when he goes back, he sees on the table of Juan Perón a photograph or a painting or a picture of Mao Zedong himself. That's the end of the story. But I think the story reveals lots of things. In Federico's convincing treatment, there's certainly a definite yet changing or fluctuating relationship between Peronism and fascism. That fluctuation partially coincides with the conflicts between left and right Peronism, but it's not restricted just to that. Perón himself has, in his presentation, fascist beginnings, immersion in the specific Argentine clerical fascist variety, mobilizing around strong conspiratorial conception of the enemy. He's even part of a fascist government, but within that government he establishes new relations that lead beyond mere fascism. According to Federico, Peronist populism is ultimately different than fascism because of two factors: the absorption of issues of the left and the workers' movement in an initially fascist-related friend-enemy perspective, so he's social, and secondly, because he shifts from a pure authoritarian position that characterizes clerical fascism to an electoral one. Technically, he stays within democracy, as Federico stresses. In his argument, however, we should not conceive of this movement as a linear evolution. I would rather think it is actually, from at least a certain developmental point on, a kind of containment, a kind of inclusion within a single, as Ernesto Laclau's MP signifier, the leader's name, the leader's persona, of simultaneous left and right positions, democratic and anti-democratic perspectives even. And it is possible for that reason to see, as Federico sometimes does, Perón as a fascist, or Peronism sometimes, as he also does, as a type of democracy, although I don't think he goes with Laclau very far in that second direction. Part of Federico's own ambiguity has to do with grammar. Populism can be used both as a noun and as an adjective. As a noun, it establishes a possibility of discrete ideal types among which one can make clear and distinct differences. But as an adjective, there is a possibility of a spectrum with degrees. For example, degree of inclusion and redistribution. Different populist movements and Peronism at different times takes a different attitude about how much social policy, how much redistribution one is to have. And of course there can be degrees of democracy too, to the extent that competitive elections can be more free or less free, as indeed they were at different times under Juan Perón, who himself won 3 elections under rather different conditions. As a noun, however, one can locate, and I will try to also do this, one can locate Peronist populism as an ideal type between fascism and democracy. In Federico's book, at least, fascism is presented as a mobilizing form of authoritarian rule with a leadership that embodies the nation with strong friend and enemy relations in its core. Democracy presents largely as electoral representation, and I think he agrees with the view that democracy keeps the space of power empty, in part because of electoral and constitutional mechanisms. Populism as a form of rule seems to be on the contrary, the occupation of that space of power, but using electoral mechanisms for part of its legitimation, and indeed sometimes social policy. Social inclusion and redistribution, finally, are not a choice for populism in the sense of a substantive or a noun, as they are for democracy and fascism. They are definitional. Democracy can be more or less populist in adjectival sense. Fascism can be more or less populist in adjectival sense, but populism in the sense of a noun obviously has to be almost tautologically populist. Peronism for Ernesto Laclau is an empty signifier, and I already mentioned this concept. What is really interesting, I think, in Federico's analysis is that he raises the question, although not from theoretical point of view, but in terms of his presentation, whether it is not a floating signifier. Ernesto Laclau illustrated floating in terms of the Front National and the French Communist Party, but isn't Peronism a better example? Let me, for a second, go back to the Joe Baxter story. In a matter of days, I don't know how many days took place between the 2 interviews of Joe with Juan Perón. In a matter of days, Perón has shifted from right neo-fascist populism, right, to left populism, at least in a symbolic sense. Now, of course, he's playing a game, but it doesn't matter. It works certainly for Joe Baxter. And let's note that Joe Baxter himself has floated, because in your presentation, he's first presented as a right-wing Peronist, or at least a mainline one, a center one, with terroristic inclinations, and then turns out to be a left Peronist who maybe is a little bit upset about having to hear about Mussolini one more time from the master. This story, where both people's ideologies are floating, may be in fact characteristic of the Peronist phenomena as such. And if Laclau is right that the empty signifier of the name of Perón defines this movement, then certainly one has to say that that name receives dramatically different symbolic contents, first also by the leader himself, and even more importantly, by the different factions who play out the dynamic of floating deadly earnestly in Argentina, as Federico describes them. Between left and right Peronism, there are cycles of kidnappings, assassinations, and other major acts of terror. Let me conclude. In Federico Finchelstein's excellent presentation, Peronism is not dangerous because it represents one form of authoritarianism. It is dangerous because it can float back and forth among options of barely populist anti-democratic fascism, social and technically or marginally democratic populism. It can even float, if I'm right, to a more democratic and less socially conscious regime, as in the case of Carlos Menem's presidency, which I don't think you really discuss in this book, but I think you will agree with perhaps that presentation. This is why when its authoritarian aspects are attacked, and this happens here because I, like Federico, generally speaking, attack populist positions. When we attack them, many people, including a lot of the students, can answer, but it is inclusive and there are elections. And that is also true. Exactly what the phenomenon is. It can be authoritarian without elections. It can be authoritarian exclusionary. It can also adopt left-wing and populist policies. But both belong to its essence, not just one side. The development, finally, is not linear progressive. Peronist organizations like Tacuara and AAA in his presentation can become fascist. So Baron himself may have moved from fascism, this is usually the usual view, to a social, a socially conscious, inclusive position. But even himself, after his electoral turn and social turn, has reverted at times to fascism. All this, I think, is brilliantly described by Federico, and for all these reasons, we owe him a big debt for having reconstructed this book.
Thank you.
Everyone, so I will present some thoughts about this book from the point of view of a historian of Latin America, no? And from that point of view, one could describe this book as a genealogy of the fascist ideas that informed the last military dictatorship in Argentina between 76 and 83, as a regime where these ideas were fully put into practice, were taken to their extreme consequences. So the book, as has been described, follows the stages of that construction. No? It's obviously a lot more that we have here. The research and the writing of the book culminates the work of Federico since the previous books on Uriburu, on the Italian and Argentine fascist connection, and an earlier book, La Argentina Fascista, published in 2008. No? But I think that the ideological origins of the war, this book, really changes the way in which we look at Argentinian history. I mean, that's what I would try to propose here, no? And so I'll offer a few notes on why that's the case. The first one that has been mentioned, but I will put it more rudimentary terms, is that there were moments of great popularity of the dictatorship in Argentina. Federico mentions 78 during the World Cup, 82 during the Malvinas Falkland War, and I would say 76, the moment of the coup was about. I remember my grandmother saying, when the coup was being announced on the radio, it was about time. Good, now this mess will end, right? Never mind that her son was already in exile, but she saw this as and I bet a lot of people saw this as a good thing, no? So it's very important to remember that, because the memory of that period in Argentina, which has been used politically, is that there was no such thing, that there was either complicity or fear and silence. But there was a lot of support to the junta. No? There are other aspects of the book that also have been mentioned, and I think are very important and very contentious, and hopefully they will generate a discussion and more research. One is the role of the Catholic Church, that has been mentioned already, and Federico says, it's an essential component of nationalist ideology, of Argentine fascism. The idea of the church and of the cross and the sword is very important, and he offers a lot of evidence about the support of the church hierarchy to the junta. Obviously, this will be polemic, I think, because it clearly contradicts some aspects of Catholic doctrine. In other words, the justification of violence that some of these bishops engaged in during the dictatorship was something that you could contradict also following, or using the same Catholic doctrine. So that's a story that needs to be, addressed, I think, and obviously this is a very important moment to go back and look at it, because there's a Pope right now in Rome who was there and was in part doing that. So I think it's very important to say this, with all the clear words that we find in this book, no? The other very important contribution, in my opinion, is that in chapter 5, which is a chapter that was entirely new for this book, no, is that as Andrew mentioned, the origins of the main guerrilla organizations in the 70s, the Montoneros and the ERP, the other kind of Trotskyist organization, are in Peronism, and more specifically in Tacuara, this violent fascist or nationalist organization that emerged in the 50s, anti-Semitic, an organization that saw violence as a way to redeem the nation. So what we see, and this book I think is magnificent in the way in which it shows it, is if we follow this genealogy, but when we arrive at the 70s, we have two groups supposedly opposed, fighting each other, the AAA and the Montoneros and the Earth, who have been construed as the two demons that were, pulling the Argentine society in both directions, but were in fact very close to each other, very similar to each other. They were the children of the same organization, right? And what Federico is saying is that these guys imagine both sides, the right and the left, imagine violence as a way to redeem the nation, war as something that purified, that changed in a good way the society, And what was happening is that their imagination of the powers of violence was becoming reality, was becoming the reality in which everyone lived. And then he says, when the military came and the AAA was no longer necessary and the Montoneros had been effectively exterminated, the military in a way continued with that through the camps, through the concentration or extermination camps, where they continued to use this idea that violence in the form of torture but also disappearance was going to redeem the nation, was going to purify Argentina and create something new and good out of this mess. So in other words, what we see is that these fascist origins of political forces created a frame for the history of Argentina that the junta came to fulfill. But obviously, again, memory is very important here, and this book will be very important, I think, in the revisions of this past. There's a lot that is left outside of that reality that was created by these groups. Most of the victims had nothing to do with either side in this struggle. So what Federico says is that victims don't create the meaning of the violence. The violence, the meaning of violence is created by the perpetrators, not by the victims of it. I think it's a very important point, but also one that will generate a lot of discussion, because obviously you can see victimhood as something that generates meaning from a Catholic perspective. In other words, martyrdom is something that is witnessing, redemption too. So I think it's very important to have this book in order to have a very good discussion about that. I think that, as a historian, I think that this book also changes the way in which we organize the periods of Argentine history. Basically, what Federico is saying here is between 1930, the first military coup that had clear fascist influences, and 1983, the fall of the military dictatorship, the last one, we have something going on, something that has some coherence, that can define a period of Argentine history. Obviously, as a historian, this goes against the usual periodization in which we talk about the década infame, Peronism, the fragile democracies that followed it with proscription of Peronism, then brief return of Perón, and then the dictators. There are different periods in which this history has been, defined. But what Federico is showing is, here we have a period where fascism was extremely influential, where it really created the reality of politics in Argentina, sandwiched by two, liberal democratic regimes that, at least the first one was not strong enough, right? And the current one, obviously is, we hope, stable and long-lasting. But this will really, I think, force us to rethink the narrative of Argentine history, because, and this is something that is very important too, it decenters Peronism. Peronism is no longer the axis of everything that happened in Argentina. It's an aspect of a process that has an origin before Perón, and it has consequences that go beyond Perón and anything that we can, recognize as orthodox Peronism. There is such thing, right? So, I could continue. I have other notes here. But I think that this will be very useful for historians like me, and And I'm a historian like Federico, and I think we share very good moments around the writing of this book. Reading some chapters, and some other less pleasant aspects of the job of being a historian. We both have to focus a good part of our research, not all of it, but a good part of our work as researchers, on characters that are violent, often ignorant, seldom celebrated by posterity. He works with the nacionalistas and other varieties of fascism, and I work with Mexican criminals. So we have that in common. We also have to read these horrible magazines. Some are ideological, mine are about crime, but they have ugly pictures, and but you have to be patient and read them. We both find solace in reading Roberto Bolaño's La Literatura Nazi in America. That's something that we share, and in a way it rescues us from that hard job. No? So, despite the occasional indignities of research, books like this one remind me, at least, that it is still necessary to look at those characters in order to understand the moral ambiguities of our present. And the fact that Federico does it with such intelligence and courage is very good, is very is something that we all should celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you.
We happen to have the author of the book with us. Federico, please.
Yes, I will be very brief and in a way proverbial, in the sense that I would like first to thank, I see a lot of people here, including in this table and as well as in the audience, that have helped me a lot in writing, reformulating, and thinking this book. So in a way, this is one of the moments, the great moments of a researcher, the book presentation among basically colleagues and friends that have helped so much in writing it and in changing it and in rethinking it. And particularly the people that are sitting at this table. And to me that is very meaningful. In terms of, I would like to address a couple of, there are many ways to read the book that transcend my own, perhaps narrower way of reading it, and I would like to address, all these very generous and insightful readings that you have shared with me and the public here. So perhaps not even a comment on a comment, but just I would like to address it and think and see how I think about them. But to me, it's really extremely rewarding. To see, how you have, having commented on the writing of it now, have reacted on the actual artifact. That is, it's a moment of great joy to have the book, but also such a relief that is this is not here anymore. In a way, at least as the difference between the object and the idea, and in that regard, to me, this is, it cannot be better than this. In terms of, I would like to take one of Jose's comment about, the particular shift from the transnational to basically a national history. So having. I like to, in a way, because I guess also biographically, because I play soccer, you cannot be on the same position all the time, but this will seem like a very radical change, and I have been both here as well as in the profession at large, obviously so, because I have written a transnational history. I have been a great advocate of this moment in the historical discipline in which we engaged in transnational, and paradoxically my following book is a very transnational history. But you have pointed out basically the connections between the two, because I really thought that I was writing also a national history that was deeply transnational. Because I understand this transnational approach as basically another way to understand the national, in a way. And something that I found along this, in this journey, was something that is in this book, and I'm sure of that because I'm working on other projects, will be in the next ones, which is something like, I mean, for lack of a better term, and it involves also the word, the kind of part of the word trans, because this is the transcontextual. Because I basically, it's not only, I mean, in my previous work was transnational in the sense of a synchronic relation and interaction and exchange among two national ideologies with global implications. I mean, Italian fascism and Argentine fascism, and with all the distinctions that they had. And here, I mean, there was something else, because while I was moving across this kind of perhaps short 20th century in Argentina, I was not only, I mean, these were not only synoptic relations, but how the characters are thinking all the time about the past, and especially, and this is something that all of you highlighted, I mean, how they are all the time thinking about what fascism is, and after 45, what fascism was, because there is an understanding that there is a previous era. I mean, this rupture before and after 45. So that was really interesting. I mean, although I agree with Pablo, because we are all the time complaining about how obnoxious these characters are. I mean, they are, I mean, people that you would not like to have a drink with. And obviously, by my particular subject position, they would not like to have a drink with me anyway. But the thing is, I mean, what also was very interesting to me is how they are thinking about historiographical, in a way, or not historiographical, but historical shifts and historical paradigms, and they are constantly rethinking. And Andrew is fully right. I do not use that, I mean, that language that Claude uses, but you are fully right that it could be used, and I would like to use it in a way, because it's a kind of applying a kind of negative dialectic to Claude, if you will, because it's taking him on his own terms, and it is a floating signifier. And they are all the time rethinking.
Float.
Yes, and they are all the time rethinking what fascism is. These are the three first chapters, and then in the other chapters they are thinking about what fascism was and how it connects to the present. And this is part of the genealogy. It's not only me. I mean, it's rather than me in a way. I mean, it's me, of course, trying to see what are these genealogies. I was very interested in how they are thinking these genealogies, and the meaning making that then they assign to the victims as well. Right? I mean, and this is something that of course is very important for me, and that is also interesting, because fascism in itself was a floating signifier, to use that term.
Yes.
Because famously, as Sternhell, Seb Sternhell, I mean, who I think is the most important scholar of fascism, he says, I mean, famously, this is the title of one of his books, one of the best, Neither Right Nor Left, because in a way, what fascism was. Right? I mean, and it's very difficult to understand. So if you, I mean, for them, I mean, not only for us, but for them. So you have all these historians attempting to, in a way, fix the matter, and in a way like Claude was doing, and make it, stand on firmer ground. But that was never the case for fascism. And so Italian fascism, for example, I mean, in 1919, it has social implications that it will not have during the time that it's a regime, and those implications return by the end. In 43 with the Salon Republic, in a way connecting with what eventually Peronism will be. And what is interesting is not that I'm saying this, but this is what the sources are somehow feeling. I mean, both in Argentina and in Italy. And there are some few sources. I mean, they could have become another project, but there are few sources in which fascists, I mean, in this book also, in which Italian fascists are saying, well, this is it. This is what fascism can be after 45. So, I mean, and then, I think, Dick, that you pointed out, I mean, both starting, I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, symbolically you started with the beginning of the book and the end of the book, but it is a metaphor that becomes, in a way, much more than that, because this is how I started. I mean, in the sense that for me it starts and ends with the present. And it's interesting that, I mean, I guess I'm not that original in that sense, is that when we, I mean, and I mean the generation of Argentine historians that started when I started in the university in Argentina in the 1990s, we were all talking about the dictatorship, but we were working on the 19th century, we were working on the 1930s. Nobody was touching the dictatorship. I mean, and for me this was very personal and very difficult to write, particularly the last two chapters, and because it was my own history in a way,
Right.
and even to the extent that I had these uncanny situations. That, I mean, when I was reading the papers, I saw advertisements or things about places that I remember as a child. And that was, I mean, for an historian, that is a stain on, not firm ground. And in a way, it's very.
But it gives special power to the book.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you thank you for saying that, because I get, it's very rewarding that you say that. But because basically this was a starting point. This is so in a way it cannot be more personal than I guess as I am in the kind of historical writing that I do, this is probably the most personal. And then there is a question, which I was asking. And in a way, well, that is also uncanny in many ways. That is to say that in a way I'm repeating now with the hat of an historian and a professor at the New School the same question I was asking when I was the age of my elder daughter. Which is why this is going on. Because and then also Pablo and Andrew addressed this issue, because the Dirty War was a war that was done after the repression of the insurgency was technically over. So in other countries it could have finished in chapter 5. All these crazy 60s, and then repression. Perhaps Brazil is more related to that situation. To some extent, well, it's another discussion, but so you have a strong repression and then a sort of, that is there are many cases like this. But then what you get is that these people wanted much more than that. And there are, in a way, there are many things that were difficult to write about the book. But these people were not shy. All my sources are never shy. So, that is very helpful, because, they are both symptomatic in the sense that they represent the problem that I'm analyzing, but also, as they understand it at least, they engage in some sort of fascist thinking. So, that is also interesting, because they are trying to address these issues again and again and again. And in terms of the relationship between the personal and the sources, then chapter 6 becomes, the end of the genealogy, and I see this as a kind of, what happens in the torture chambers is a substantiation of the ideology that I have been talking about. So it's a chapter that really becomes about the relationship between theory and practice, perhaps much more than the others, but not because of let's say, a change in my historiographical method, but just because that is the case. That is what's going on. They really, of course there are a lot of ruptures and there are a lot of relationship between ideology and practice. But finally I see that moment as a moment of substantiation. This is the moment when ideology will eventually be put into practice, creating new worlds of meaning and new realities, basically. Mm-hmm. And that is the sense in which I say, well, these realities cannot have meaning for the victims outside of the ideology. And also that's very interesting, because the moment in which we, and Pablo is totally right about martyrdom, that could be a meaning for the victims, but in a way, and it has happened, and it's happening all the time, including the current official politics of memory. But it's not the language of historiography, it's the language of the mythical, the language of martyrdom, which is very, very interesting, because by the end, what you have with these ideas against a consensus. That basically, there was no consensus for, I'm not saying, and I fully disagree with that idea, but in the current politics of memory, it will be that there was no consensus. There were the bad guys and the good guys, and population was basically out of it. And when there is a historical shift in terms of the politics of memory, because this is not that different to the so-called teoría de los dos demonios, or the theory of the two demons of the 1980s. In the 1980s, then the outcome of that situation, that there were two demons fighting, two, people, that were responsible, the right and the left, and society was innocent, meaning social liberal democracy. In that case, the radical administration and so on and so forth. So that was the outcome of that idea now, then in the 80s. Now, what you have here now is the return, in a very uncanny way, the return of that idea of basically two actors deciding on things, the left and the right, and then it's an accusation against society for having done nothing. But at the end of this mythical, meaning that when one criticizes the current government of Argentina, the accusation might emerge that criticism is coming somehow of a, I guess for people my age, it would be some sort of phantasmatic association with the dictatorship. We were not there in a meaningful sense. But somehow it will be implied that a criticism of the current politics of memory will mean that that people like the dictatorship. That is, and at the end of that mythical understanding, there is a historiographical problem, which is that there was a lot of consensus, as Pablo said. So it's interesting that we are switching, basically going from one myth to another one. But now society is, particularly the middle classes, are guilty of having done nothing, which is very curious. And now, going back to Andrew's, reading of the populism part of the book, that is probably one of the most polemical, dimensions, at least in Argentina, because I have been advancing some of these arguments in the press, and some people are really mad about this. But the irony is that I'm all the time seriously, as I want to think that I'm very serious about it, grappling with the issue of yes or no. I'm not saying that Peronism is fascism. I'm trying to think contextually what is the relationship and why we went from an either left nor right that was fascist to an either left nor right that was something very different. This is, at this one point and yet it was uncannily very similar. And this is what I'm trying to understand contextually, and uttering the question for some people in my country is basically a problem. Anecdotically, last week I published an article in one of Argentina's most important newspapers, Clarín, and I said that one cannot basically equate Peronism with fascism. I was very clear about that. It was a sentence. I said it as I'm saying it now. And then in the official, a colleague of mine actually, an historian, wrote in the official, it will be like Telam, which is the official news agency. It will be like AP, but official. Right? The official news agency of the country. He wrote that two things, he said, which is very interesting, very symptomatic in that sense. One is that by just asking the question, and even if I say no, I'm somehow talking about something that shouldn't be talked about. And the second, it was that I am an operative, which was an operative. Basically, it's a mysterious association that somehow I'm operating for someone. Which of course in terms of
a foreign,
no, an nation.
You must
But that is also, very interesting because in this kind of model, and again, how one could think. What are the democratic roots of this kind of thinking? Whereas an argument that disagrees with a particular ideology somehow is put as a kind of being interested in material, or being basically the agent of material interest, or certainly be outside of the realm of the country. So this understanding of the nation, in a way involves both a particular right and also somehow non-Marxist, self-identified leftist reading of the problem. And what is interesting, and I will finish probably with this, is that, it is very interesting to see, how this changes. And you were right that I don't talk much about Menem and the neoliberal phase of Peronism, which, as in the case of this book, that's something that is interesting in the book, about the connections. And I say this in the beginning of the book, is that the senior members of the junta studied in military academies in the 1930s with Argentine fascists as teachers. So this is not really not only an intellectual history of people thinking about, it's about also personal connections. Now, that's one fact. Another fact is that basically a big chunk of the current self-identified leftist members of the current administration have actively participated of the neoliberal administration of Menem. And now another irony is that Menem is a supporter of the current government in the Senate. He's a senator who is aligned with the current government. Now, which brings the question of, the floating signifier and what kind of left or right is this? And something which is very interesting, and this is coming out of my contextual analysis, is that, there is a constant tendency to shift, yes, but also a constant tendency to appropriate the category. So when we are right, and we represent somehow the right. But now when we are left, and we represent the left. And those, this is also really, really interesting in a way, how, in a way, Peronism operates. And Pablo's notion about decentering Peronism is central. And I will finish with the following anecdote. As you know, the current, or as you might know, the current chief of the armed forces has been seriously accused of having participated in human rights violations during the Dirty War. And he has been nominated to this position by the current president. And in a way, this is an important shift, going back to, to this constant floating from a government that basically was rooted in a kind of relation with human rights, to human rights identification and a constant denunciation of violations of human rights, to the particular support for people that have been implicated in the fight, but on the other side. And now, what is interesting that the constant defense at some quarters of this new association between the government and certain people that participated of these events is that this is our army now. Going back to the fight, and this is our army now. This is our army, and now they are with us. And basically, some important people close to the government have said, well, these are people. That this is the army that our kids wanted. So now, what is interesting is now the so-called leftist fight of the 60s and 70s was to have an army and to have a right army, the national and popular army. So this is interesting because that is a way. And I will finish with this. In which you can see all these constant rewritings and resignifications of this very long history. So I will finish there. Thank you very much.